The dynamics in my wife's family always puzzled me. There seemed to be an inexplicable hostility in every interaction. Every encounter was like walking through a minefield. The tension felt almost palpable. Every visit from my mother-in-law, Linda, turned into an ordeal for both Sarah and me. No matter what Sarah did, Linda found a way to criticize it. It wasn't always direct, but her disapproval seeped through in comments, expressions, and even in silence. Sometimes she praised, but even then her compliments carried a sarcastic tone and made Sarah feel inferior rather than uplifted. One particular visit left an indelible mark on my memory. Linda threw a look of contempt at Sarah that imprinted itself on my memory, her eyes full of an emotion I couldn't decipher: disappointment, resentment, perhaps something even deeper. Interestingly, Linda had never treated me with hostility. Moreover, she was surprisingly friendly. We were comfortable talking, and she often smiled at me during our conversations. I made small talk, trying to ease the awkwardness, and she nodded, her demeanor warm and accommodating. Meanwhile, Sarah looked visibly uncomfortable. Her eyes darkened with frustration and her fingers twitched nervously. She glared at me, silently begging me to stop talking to her. Their relationship was undeniably strained, a strange, unsettling dynamic that I had a hard time understanding. It seemed like they were constantly fighting, a cold war waged by glances and passive remarks. Linda was undeniably attractive despite her age. If she and Sarah stood side by side, people sometimes mistook them for sisters. She was meticulous about her appearance and exuded a confidence that was effortless. Her hair was always perfectly styled, her makeup was subtle but flawless, and her clothes emphasized her figure without being flashy. She possessed an aura that made people turn their heads when she entered a room, confident, assertive, almost untouchable. Eventually, Sarah reached her limit and decided to spend the night at her friend's house, leaving me alone with Linda. I didn't mind Linda, and I had always had a friendly relationship. There was an ease between us that I never questioned, a sense of familiarity that made her presence comforting, at least at first glance. That night, as we sat down to dinner, I noticed that her gaze lingered on me. Her gaze was different, intense, searching. Every time I looked up from my plate, she smiled at me coquettishly. There was nothing inappropriate about it, but there was something about the way she looked at me that kept me awake, though I couldn't guess what it was. The air between us seemed to thicken, and I became more cautious, more aware of her presence. "So, Mike, aren't you sick of my daughter yet?" she asked suddenly. Her tone was teasing, but there was an almost predatory note to it. Her eyes stopped on mine, and I saw the challenge in them, the provocation. I nearly choked on my food, caught off guard by the question. "No, of course not, Linda," I mumbled, giggling nervously and trying to play it off as a joke, though I could clearly hear the discomfort in my voice. I couldn't understand why she would say something like that, and the words hung in the air, thick and unpleasant. She pressed her lips together, keeping her eyes on me as if studying me, waiting for something. "She's unlucky, you know," she said, and her voice softened, taking on an almost sad tone. "I'm worried that one day you might give up on her," she added, keeping her gaze on me. There was a sadness in her voice that caught me off guard, a vulnerability that was so at odds with the confident, almost bossy woman I recognized. I shook my head, trying to dispel the anxiety. "I love Sarah. We are one family, for better and for worse," I replied in a firmer tone, wanting to put an end to her game. But before I could say anything else, Linda stood up from her chair, her sharp nails scratching my shoulder as she moved closer, her touch lingering for a second. I started to object, my voice caught in my throat, but she pressed a finger to my lips, her eyes fixed into mine with such intensity that my heart raced. "Don't be so quick to refuse, Mike," she whispered, her voice soft but commanding, and I could hear the challenge in her tone. Without waiting for my response, she slid into my lap, her eyes daring me to push her away. "Linda, we can't," I began in a barely audible whisper, confusion and anxiety raging in my head. But she leaned closer, her lips almost touching my ear. "Why not?" she whispered, her breath warm against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. "No one has to know. Just you and me, Mike. Just for tonight." Her words were a dangerous temptation, her voice a siren call that simultaneously repelled and beckoned me. Some part of me, some dark, hidden part, was reaching for her in that moment, a part that wanted to give in to the excitement, the danger. The way she looked at me, the way her body pressed against mine, it all seemed so intoxicating, so wrong, and yet so exciting. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest, my thoughts jumbling in my head. "Linda, this isn't right," I said, my voice firmer this time, though still trembling slightly. Her expression wavered, a flicker of vulnerability on her face, but she quickly hid it with a smile, and her eyes narrowed slightly, as if she was trying to read me, to gauge my resolve. "Maybe you're right," she said faintly, almost wistfulness in her voice, as she slowly stood up, her hands lingering on my shoulders before she finally stepped away. She gave me one last look of regret and something I couldn't quite pinpoint, and then turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the weight of what had almost happened, unspoken words and unfulfilled desires in the air. The silence that followed was deafening, the echoes of her words and touch still echoing in the room. I sat for a long time, staring at the empty space where she had been, questions and doubts swarming in my head, my body still tingling from her touch. What had just happened? And what would happen the next time Sarah wasn't around? There was no denying that a line had been crossed that could never be crossed again, and the implications of it weighed on me. The rest of the night passed like a blur. I cleaned up after dinner, turned out the lights, locked the doors, but my thoughts were elsewhere, going over every moment, every word, every look. I couldn't escape the feel of her body on mine, the warmth of her breath, the intensity of her gaze. I knew that what had almost happened tonight wasn't just a fleeting moment of madness. It was the culmination of something that had been building up for a long time, something neither of us had recognized until now. When I finally got into bed, the emptiness beside me was overwhelming. Sarah's absence felt like a gaping hole, a reminder of everything that was at stake. I stared at the ceiling, my mind unwilling to settle, thoughts of Linda hovering in the air, her voice echoing in my ears. I knew I should talk to Sarah, tell her what had happened, but the very thought of it terrified me. How would I be able to explain this to her? How could I make her understand what I barely understood myself? The next morning, Linda was gone. She had left a note on the kitchen table, a simple message saying that she had an appointment and didn't want to wake me up. The note was short, almost mundane, but I couldn't help but read between the lines, wondering if she had something else to say. I crumpled the note in my hand, and a wave of frustration swept over me. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but at the same time I was glad she was gone. It gave me time to think, to figure out what to do next. When Sarah returned later that afternoon, she seemed lighter, more at ease, as if the night of visiting had done her good. She smiled at me, and I tried to smile back, but it was forced, the weight of the previous night weighing on me. I watched her move around the apartment, her laughter filling the space, and I couldn't escape the guilt a knot formed in my stomach. I knew I had to tell her, but I didn't know how. I don't know yet. Whatever it was, I knew one thing: my wife's family was more complicated than I'd ever imagined, and now I was in the middle of something I'd never expected. Linda's behavior had changed everything, and I would have to face the consequences of that night sooner or later. There was no escaping it. And as I watched Sarah, her face full of hope and love, I realized how high the stakes really were.